Okay, in this second video about balance sheets, we're going to look at comparing balance sheets, and we're going to do that a fair amount in this course, looking at comparing companies, comparing performance between companies in the same industry, and even comparing the performance of a company over time, so comparing it to itself. But in order to do comparative analysis, we need to have a few characteristics, a few things in mind in order for it to be useful. So the first thing is to think about industry characteristics and dynamics. So we need to think about the type of industry, what they're involved in. Different industries are going to be more or less capital intensive. That is, some industries there's going to be a huge amount of fixed assets, a lot of property, plant, and equipment, a lot of retail locations, a lot of leases, a lot of furniture inside, fixtures, and that sort of thing. Another aspect of the industry might be its competitiveness, so that's going to affect the balance sheet. If firms are kind of oligopolies, monopolies in an industry, or if it's a very competitive setting. And then also the regulatory setting. So what the laws look like, what kind of oversight there is, what kind of legal requirements are on firms might impact how much assets they have. In thinking of banks, there's a kind of a regulatory setting that they have to operate in where they have a set amount of capital or a reserve amount of capital to make sure that they are financially fit to survive a kind of an economic downturn or an economic hit. So all of these things around the industry are going to impact the balance sheet, and then they're going to impact the income statement as well, and we'll talk about that later. Thinking about firm strategies, that also impacts the balance sheet in a significant way. Where a firm is in the development stage or where it is in its life cycle. Early stage firms or early life firms, when they're kind of in their infancy, their balance sheets are going to look a certain way. As firms mature, become kind of the cash cows, their balance sheet may look very different. So the market share that a firm has is going to impact its balance sheet as well as the capital structure. So the capital structure that a firm chooses largely going to be a function of the industry it operates in, the kinds of assets it's investing, what are the market characteristics of those assets. But anyway, that impacts very clearly the balance sheet. So a firm that has a very high level of debt, that's going to show up in the balance sheet, and then the same thing for firms that don't have a whole lot of assets. That's mainly intellectual kind of capital. Their biggest assets are the people, so there's not a whole lot of money sunk into kind of physical structures. And so that's going to impact the capital structure. And then lastly, we're going to think about the quality of the financial statements. Anytime we're looking at comparing firms and using numbers that we're deriving from financial statements, we need to think about, how good is the input or the numbers that we're using for our inputs from these financial statements. Have they been audited, for instance? And even when they've been audited, they can have varying degrees of quality. Later on in the semester, we may look in some detail about earnings quality and earnings management, or those kind of things, window dressing, policies around that. And then lastly, with the quality of financial statements, we need to think about and look into, investigate the discretionary policies that the firm's managers may use. So there's different kind of thresholds for things like revenue recognition. There's different choices that managers can make along the lines of things like inventory methods, so FIFO and LIFO. The choice that you make there has implications for your balance sheet and your income statement. It can make you look better or worse than other firms in your industry, especially if you have a different inventory method. I'm not sure if we're going to get into modifying firms or comparing firms with different inventory methods. That might be a little bit beyond the scope of our class, but if you ever pursue the CFA, the Chartered Financial Analyst designation, there's kind of a portion of that where you would make adjustments to compare a LIFO firm to a FIFO firm in the same industry. There's going to be some things that might confound the numbers or give a rise to wrong conclusions because you're not really comparing apples to apples. So you can do things to balance sheets to make them more comparative. And then the same thing with depreciation. There may be different depreciation rules that firms are following. There's some discretion in the depreciation choices that they make. So we need to have all of these things in mind anytime we're comparing companies or comparing a firm over time. So with comparative analysis, let's look at just a few examples here. So if you think about a retail firm, especially one that's selling technology things, maybe they have a website or they have a number of locations that they're selling products. These firms are going to typically have very high inventory ratios. So comparatively, they will have a lot of inventory as opposed to, you know, the Apples of the world, where that's mainly a kind of an R&D creation kind of a firm. Apple doesn't make and store a lot of iPhones and iPads and computers. That's manufactured and distributed to retailers who hold that stuff. So financial services firms, you know, banking firms, they're going to look very kind of peculiar and particular in their characteristics. So they'll typically have a very large portion of cash and securities. The biggest asset that they're going to have is the loans that they've made to other people. So they're going to be very cash intensive and look very different than than other firms in other industries. In a technology firm, if you think about what they might look like, they're going to have very high proportions of cash and marketable securities. They were typically going to have low proportions of property, plant, and equipment. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, their biggest asset is their people. And so they're going to look fairly different in terms of their balance sheet to other firms in other industries. Another thing that's typically true of technology firms, particularly ones that have been very successful, is that they're going to have low long-term debt. So the point is here, anytime you're thinking about a firm looking at their financial statements, you need to have a kind of a bigger picture in mind. Think about their industry that they're in, think about where they are in their life cycle, think about their market share, think about the regulatory setting, etc. And as we look in coming classes and think about ratios, this is all going to become very important as we think about analyzing a firm's financial statements. We always need to have kind of the setting in mind, kind of the bigger picture as we drill down to give context to everything that we're looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. We've kind of wrapped up here the balance sheet portion of our initial discussion, and we'll, in the next video, take a look at an overview of the income statement. So I'll see you then.
Sun is shining in the sky. There ain't a cloud in sight. It stopped raining. Everybody's still in play. And don't you know, it's a beautiful new day. Hey, running down the avenue, see how the sun shines brightly in the city. On the streets where once was pretty, Mr. Blue Sky is living here today. Hey, Mr. Blue Sky, please tell us why.